The process of learning, an examination of the construction integration model for course comprehension. Chapter 1. Research in Learning and Memory. Researching the process of learning is important to understanding how we learn and how we should instruct to support learning. In 1885, one of the first to examine learning was Hermann Ebbinghaus. He wanted to study learning without the use of prior knowledge. To do this, he created strings of nonsense syllables, which would not have been familiar and therefore not in long-term memory. He found that after learning the strings of nonsense syllables, his memory of them decreased as a function of time. Thus, the forgetting curve. This was one of the most basic findings on memory and learning. And this, of course, is applicable to other nonsense syllables. The moral of the story? When learning, studying once will not be sufficient for exams in 1 month, so make sure to study, restudy, and study again. Much later, in 1956, George Miller famously found that we are able to remember and recall 7 plus or minus 2 items from our working memory. However, recently Cowan and his colleague Chen came along and have suggested rather that we are able to hold 3 to 5 chunks of items in our working memory. Now, Miller can be sure to not forget any items on his shopping list. Chapter 2. Learning from Discourse. Although these previously mentioned findings are informative to understanding learning, Walter Kinch points out that models for memory need not be restricted to list learning studies, but also memory for text and discourse, which includes more complex coding processes. One of the first to examine learning from text was Frederick Bartlett, who in 1932 examined participants' memory of a story, War of the Ghosts. One night, 2 men went down to the river. They heard a war cry. The story continues, but what Bartlett found was that people commonly remember the main themes of stories, but not the details. Does this sound familiar? Maybe in the past you remember the theme of where your car was, but not the detailed location. Be it spoken or written text, the majority of the discourse we encounter, we take away the main overarching ideas and not the details, unless, of course, we take the time to elaborate. For example, when your mom is lecturing you, you might remember that she was mad, but not the detail of the list of chores she wants you to do. To study discourse comprehension, starting in the 1970s, Walter Kinch, with help from Tien Van Dyke and David Welsh, created a model for discourse comprehension, the construction integration model. Such a model is important, especially for studying the process of discourse comprehension, for creating appropriate instruction and learning strategies. Chapter 3. The construction integration model. In this model of discourse comprehension, the learner attains information from the discourse, and with the combination of prior knowledge, creates mental representations of the meaning of the discourse. This mental representation is then integrated into long-term memory. The creation of this mental model goes through 3 main stages: the construction of micro-propositions, macro-propositions, and the final situation model. Stage 1. Micro-propositions. For the first stage in this process of discourse comprehension, the discourse is brought into the model and processed in multiple cycles. For each cycle, given that the short-term memory, or that is the buffer, is limited, the sentences are brought into the system one at a time. As each sentence is brought into the system, they are parsed into individual propositions, which are single unit ideas. Propositions can be represented as several word pairs, or they can be reduced down to a single word. These individual propositions are then integrated into a micro-proposition structure, depicting how the propositions connect together through superordinate and subordinate connections. For example, Lucy weeded the vegetable garden becomes Lucy weeded garden vegetable. See how vegetable is a unit idea subordinate to the other unit idea, garden. Or, take for example the sentence, Sarah tried to weed her father's garden, which is then parsed and structured into Sarah, try, weed, and lastly, father's garden. At this stage, prior knowledge is activated by the incoming text, and information from long-term memory that is associated with the text is also brought into the buffer to connect to the micro-proposition structure, such as Sarah is associated with girl, and pretty from previous connections found in the long-term memory. Likewise, weeding is associated with working and dirty, and garden is associated with flowers. In this model, long-term memory is thought of as a stored network of propositions. Connections between the mass amount of propositions and long-term memory are organized into a network and connected by varying degrees of connections, from connections being very strong, such as Sarah to girl, and others being very weak, like weeding to fun. So, when prior knowledge is activated, a spread of activation occurs in the network, allowing several inferences and elaborations to be brought into the buffer and connected to the micro-proposition structure. Given that long-term memory is a never-ending network of connections, if our buffer did not have a limited capacity, our micro-proposition would spread exponentially. However, only propositions that have a strong association with the text are brought into the buffer from long-term memory. At the completion of the first cycle for the first sentence, some of the propositions and their associations from the last cycle are brought into the buffer. These are the propositions considered to be the most important and are usually the main topic propositions. In this instance of the last sentence, proposition Sarah and father's garden are left in the buffer. The rest of the propositions are put into long-term store and can be readily available if later text cues its activation. Now, with more room in the buffer, the next sentence is brought in. There were 14 tulips in the garden, and now there are only 6. Like the last cycle, the sentence is parsed into propositions. Were tulips 14, garden, now tulips 6. And prior knowledge is activated to make additional associations, such as tulips to Holland and pretty. And now, connections are made between these propositions and previous propositions that were kept in the buffer, such as Sarah to tulips, garden father to garden, tulips were 14, now 6, and so on and so forth. The cycles occur for the whole discourse. Thus, at the end, the learner has constructed a final micro-proposition structure representing the actual text of the discourse. Stage 2. Macro-propositions. The micro-proposition, made of propositions directly from the discourse and prior knowledge, is then transformed into a micro-proposition. This is the gist of the discourse, as Kinch calls it. During this integration, inappropriate inferences and elaborations are filtered out. This is done by 3 rules. First, delete redundant or irrelevant propositions. From the previous example, garden father garden can then just become father garden. Second rule, choose the most relevant proposition to represent others. For example, to represent all of the propositions in the first sentence, Sarah tried to weed her father's garden, choosing just Sarah weeded. Lastly, rule number 3. Create a new proposition that summarizes the propositions found in the microstructure, such as for the second sentence, There were 14 tulips in the garden, and now there are only 6. This becomes tulips, 14, now 6. Thus, the macro structure you are left with is Sarah weeded, father garden, tulips, 14, now 6. Stage 3, situation models. The memory we have from a discourse may in fact be at the surface level. That is, a word-for-word memory of the text, or the macro proposition, that is, the gist. However, usually our memory of discourse is in the form of a mental representation of the situation from the discourse, or, as Kinch refers to it, a situation model. The situation model is constructed based on a given purpose, although sometimes a very weak purpose, such as watching a movie for entertainment. On the other hand, a student might be assigned to learn from the text what the people did. So, from the previous sentence, in the example, they remember that Sarah weeded and the father had a garden. Whatever the case, the situation model that the learner creates is then integrated into long-term memory. A situation model is created on the basis of the previous 2 representations, the micro and macro proposition structures, such as Sarah weeded, garden father, tulips, 14, now 6. With this structure, the learner further uses their prior knowledge to construct a situation model that represents the situation in the discourse relative to their own knowledge. At this point, they make inferences, such as Sarah's father was upset. This is nowhere in text, but it is inferred by the learner and built into their situation model. Other examples of inference might be believing that the hiker was afraid, when in fact, the text only states that the hiker came across a bear. Or when you read, Jack missed his class because he went to play golf. He told his teacher he was sick, and you infer that Jack lied, even though this is not mentioned. Once a situation model has been created, the learner is said to have comprehended the discourse and will be stored in long-term memory. Lastly, evidence of comprehension. After processing the discourse, comprehension can be measured in a number of ways, such as measures of recognition, recall, summarization, reconstruction of the text, and question answering. When a learner is asked to recall a discourse, they may not remember a single specific word or a set of phrases, but they can show that they understood the discourse by even expressing it in their own words. Also, if a learner is asked which of the following sentences was in the text, they could legitimately pick all of them. For example, Sarah tried to weed her father's garden. This is the only sentence actually in the text, whereas Sarah pulled out 8 tulips is a transformation of the text, and her father was upset is an inference made by the reader and was not in the text. However, if the reader picks each of these sentences, it is clear they have comprehended the text. Chapter 4. Applying the construction integration model. This model acts as a frame for research, such as studying the differing dimensions of text, like the elements of time, space, objects, causation, intentionality, and what makes a text more or less coherent. Likewise, the model can be used to form further examination of comprehension processes, like making inferences, mental control processes, and parsing. This kind of research can inform how to create instruction for better learning or strategies for learning from different forms of discourse, like books or lectures. There has been research on the strategies like note-taking, rereading, reciting, or learners considering the inferences they have made while reading. Takeaway. It may be easier to get the gist of text, but make sure to elaborate on those details. They may be important for exams and at various other times. Like your keys. Don't forget your keys.